All right, I would like to welcome to this joint event, joined with the TILE network. TILE stands for Teaching Innovation and Learning Enhancement, and joined with the Scottish Network for Able Students. Before I hand over to the wonderful Margaret Sutherland, I would like to talk a bit about TILE very shortly, what it is. It is a network that wants to bring different disciplines together, different educational sectors together to really discuss best practice in education. We have talks such as this one. So if you go on this link, I'm going to share this slide later on. You can see our schedule for all talks. We have blog posts by people on the network. We always write a reflection post on the talks. But we also very excitedly have blog posts by students, because we are representing the student voice as well at the network. Teachers are invited to contribute best practice examples. Very often teachers think, that one activity that they're doing is it's nothing. It's just, it's a little thing that they do, but that little thing could mean a difference to another teacher. So we publish best practice examples. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on our website, subscribing to our newsletters. And again, welcome to have you here today. It's wonderful. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Margaret Sutherland, who will be introduce the event and give you the details.
Thank you, Carolina. So yes, I'm Margaret Sutherland and I work here at the University of Glasgow. And I think I've had the pleasure of working at some point with all of the speakers today, which is one of the reasons I've brought them all together to speak with you this evening. I'm going to kick the session off talking a little bit about highly able learners, or depending on what part of the world you're in, gifted and talented learners. And just to kind of set the scene a little bit for the kinds of characteristics that some of these young people might display in your school and in your classroom. And then I'm handing over to 5 people, 4 presentations, to talk a little bit about projects that they've developed with young people, not initially with the idea that they would be good for highly able learners, but they're going to share those projects with you. And we're going to think how, with just little tweaks here and there, these projects are absolutely the right thing that highly able learners would be engaging in. I'm calling them highly able. That's the term that we use here in Scotland, although in England and much of the rest of the world, actually, they would be perhaps more familiar with the terms gifted and talented. So let me just share my screen here. We did practice this, so this should work. Famous last words. Here we go. So we've called this Bugs, Bees, Plants and the Great Outdoors. And of course, you will notice that there's a lot of discussion at the moment around the outdoors, about climate crisis, the planet, etc., not least because COP26, of course, is coming to Glasgow. And I think that's given us that kind of heightened awareness, heightened interest for some people in the whole idea of the outdoors. And so today's projects all have their roots in Bugs, Bees, Plants and the Great Outdoors. The running order for today is, we've had the welcome. I'm now going to talk to you just for a little bit about who this group of learners are, and then I'm handing over to our colleague Tom, who is in Cardiff, to talk about his project, to Rhea, who's going to talk about I Spot a Bee, to Catherine, who will take you through Wee Beasties, and to Cheryl and Ian, who will talk about the International Green Academy and some of that work that the Academy there is doing is being done here in Glasgow. And then we'd really like to hear from you. Please feel free to put your comments, questions into the chat box. We will pick up in these. And of course, if you can interact with us, it will be a much richer session. So as we come to look at this, we're happy to send out links and so on at the end of this, and you can also download the presentation to afterwards to listen again, or indeed to share with colleagues. Why highly able learners? Well, I'm going to argue that they're a bit of a forgotten about group. We kind of sometimes think they'll be fine. They'll go on in spite of us, not because of us. We really need to think actively, I would argue, about this group of learners. We can't just leave it to chance. Certainly, if you're in a Scottish school, then Scottish legislation says that these young people might need additional support for their learning. And so there's a legislative background as to why we need to think about this group of learners. Myself and Catherine, who you'll hear from later, are doing a little bit of research just now, working with parents and young highly able learners, talking to them about lockdown learning. And it's quite clear that some of them have absolutely flourished. There are other learners too. We might not want to talk about them being necessarily highly able, but there are many learners actually who have flourished during lockdown. Equally, we know there are many for whom that was not the experience, but that does leave schools in an interesting position now of having perhaps this wide range. We've always had a wide range, but maybe that range is even wider now than it used to be. How do we make sure we are appropriately challenging all of those learners? We can't press pause on a highly able learner. We need to make sure that we encourage and challenge these children appropriately. So I want to go over some of the characteristics that some might display. So don't sit here ticking off and think, oh, wow, my son, my daughter, they've got 9 out of the 10, they must be highly able. Well, they might be, but they don't all present with all of these characteristics. But just to give a little overview, as you're thinking about the projects you'll hear about, thinking about these characteristics, how do we match these things up in order to ensure that we're challenging the young people? They'll often read earlier than expected. Catherine and I were speaking to somebody last week, a 7-year-old who started reading fluently and with understanding when they were about age 3. So they sometimes will read earlier than expected. They can concentrate. They've got amazing ability and intensity to concentrate on something. They'll ask lots of good questions. And I think when we're starting to get into thinking about things like the climate crisis, like some of the issues that we might come across as we're thinking about COP26, they can work out what the problems are. They can begin to put bits of information together, and they can recall information very easily and very quickly too, and they can match it across different learning situations. And so you might find them starting to ask some really quite deep questions around this whole issue of sustainability, climate change, COP26, etc. They've also sometimes got a great interest in those big questions. Why are we here? What's this all about? These kind of big existential questions. The problem of suffering in the world. Why is this happening? Why can I not do something about this? Why can I not do more about this? They will sometimes be highly interested in the environmental issues that our planet is facing. And of course, we've got no shortage of issues that the planet are facing at the moment. And when you link that with that next bullet point there of sometimes some of them being highly, highly sensitive to things, then you can start to see where we need to think quite carefully in school about how we tackle issues around sustainability, climate change, climate crisis, and so on, because they may actually get quite upset. They can see the problem, they can identify it, they can read about it, they can read quite scientific explanations of the problem and the prognosis. And then you add that into this heightened hypersensitivity that they sometimes have, and they really struggle. They can feel quite helpless. They don't know how to help sort this problem. They can see the problem, but they're not quite sure what to do. They can also sometimes be very concerned about injustice. They can see, in their view, very clearly the rights and the wrongs, and be very concerned about these things. But that's some of the sides of them that are quite challenging to deal with in many ways, but they also have this wonderful intellectual curiosity, where you mention something one day and they come back the next day wanting to know more and more, and they've gone off and read something and researched and come back and they're saying, but look, but this said, and you said, but that doesn't agree. And you're like, oh my goodness. So where do you go with this? So one of the things we would be saying is schools can't do it all. We need to have layers of support built in. And sometimes engaging in the kind of projects that you're going to hear about today can offer that extra layer of support for you, but crucially for the young person as well. So what? Well, we would argue they need an appropriate, challenging curriculum. You need to plan for it. We need to be aware of these big issues. They don't need more of the same. When they finish something quickly, don't give them more of the same thing to do. They need higher order thinking skills, HOTS, not MOTS, more of the same. And please don't think they're going to be okay because they're clever. We need to help them to grow and to flourish. We need to help them now. It will influence their futures, and possibly it will just influence the future that we head into as adults as well. So those are just some big kind of overarching things I'd like you to hang on to as you listen now to our 4 presenters who will take us through today's projects. And I'm handing over, I think, first to Tom. If you follow us on Twitter, I think all of us are on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Tanzania8. There's a whole story as to why that's my Twitter handle. I'll tell you sometime if you're interested. But if you're on Twitter and you follow that, you will pick up mine and everybody else's too. So please, we'd be delighted for you to tweet as we go along, and indeed after the event too. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Tom.
Hello, everyone. Just bear with me 2 seconds while I share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see that all right. So hello, everyone. My name's Tom Smith. I'm from the University of Cardiff, although I'm speaking to you from my hometown of Swansea. I'm going to talk to you today about a project called Leicester Young Ecology Adventurers, which involved a certain amount of canoeing, thinking about the ecology along canals and heritage. And I'm going to try and think about these ideas through the idea of an unfamiliar or a familiar setting. So just to briefly talk you through the project, as Margaret's already mentioned, this project wasn't designed with thinking about different abilities of learners in mind, and it wasn't a school-based project. It's an out-of-school project that was focused on primarily on canoeing and waterways. But I think there are some interesting implications for thinking about learners of different abilities in it, and some of the challenges of dealing with a diversity of learners in these kind of outdoor education contexts. So in principle, this project was designed to connect the Somali community in Leicester to canals and waterways that were proximate to the city. And to give you a brief overview of the project itself, we were funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. It took place a couple of years ago, 2017 to 2018. It involved approximately 45 11 to 14-year-olds who took part in a 12-week series of water-based activities, some during school time and some over the school holidays. It involved a number of partners. So the primary community partner was the Somali Community Parents Association in Leicester itself. So they were the community host organisation. It was spearheaded by the Canal and Rivers Trust, and it involved the Leicester Outdoor Pursuit Centre in providing much of the activities and canoe instruction. And then finally it involved us in Cardiff University doing the independent evaluation. And I should say that this was primarily led by my colleague Hannah Pitt, and I was a part of the team that did that, but she's not here to join us today. So that was the kind of team around the project and the scope of it. So this project was based in St Matthews, an area of Leicester. It's one of the UK's most deprived neighbourhoods. Leicester is a very diverse city, and St Matthews is primarily host to one of the largest Somali communities in the UK as well. And whilst Leicester as a whole has fairly good green space provision, actually some of these more deprived neighbourhoods have really quite poor access to local quality green spaces. So, you know, part of the purpose of the project was to try and connect this inner city community to an outside space that may potentially provide kind of well-being benefits for the children and for adults as well. And of course, canals and waterways in urban areas have a variety of connotations, certainly in Leicester as they are in many places. Some of them are very beautiful, but some are quite post-industrial, dark, dirty, and really quite dangerous in places. So an interesting mix of spaces to engage with. And the primary driver for the Canal and Rivers Trust being the authority, the sort of organisation that looks after these waterways, was to try and increase the diversity of waterway use in and around this area and across the UK as well. And they've identified from previous research, some of which done through Cardiff University too, that there's quite low levels of kind of awareness, understanding and engagement with these waterways from these kinds of communities, and they themselves want to see more diversity in those that engage with the waterways that they looked after. So as part of this project, the young people took part in a range of different activities, some of them very practical, skills-based, canoeing, lock gate opening, taking a trip down the canal to see other parts of it. But they also did some more learning-based activities. So they did quite classic things like pond dipping, a bit of ecological identification. They did some foraging, and they did some more sort of tech-based stuff. So they did a little bit of filmmaking around what they did on the canal, and they set camera traps as well to capture wildlife and other things that passed by during their time. So in effect, they took part in a kind of whole program of activities, mainly geared around canoeing and learning to get about the waterways, but also to understand them better, the wildlife and the heritage of the canals. As part of this, they also all took part in the first level of the John Muir Awards. So the activities that were provided through the programme mapped onto the John Muir Award, and each of them gained the first level of the award through taking part in the project. So I'm going to race through three different kind of aspects of learning about the waterways that we picked up on as doing this project that might have some relevance to thinking about ability and competence and how that's dealt with in educational settings outdoors. I want to briefly talk about some assumptions about making young people familiar with these kinds of spaces. And I'm going to talk about three things: thinking about race and access to the waterways, drawing on the issues around ethnicity and the group that we engaged with on the project, thinking about skills and teamwork from the perspective of the young people, and thinking about discomfort on the canal and as part of taking part in these activities, and again, the consequences for learning. And then I'm going to share some thoughts about high ability learners towards the end. So first of all, I'm interested in the kind of assumptions that come with these kind of programs and these projects. I'm interested in, how we assume that young people might become familiar and comfortable with particular spaces that they're otherwise not very familiar with for various reasons. One of these assumptions, I think, and I'm making some big kind of broad brush arguments here, but basically speaking, one of these is about eco-literacy and how this is achieved through just contact with nature. Secondly, I'm quite interested in how learning skills like canoeing is often sort of thought about as quite free of social, cultural and spatial context. I'm going to comment on that a bit later. And also the idea that you become increasingly comfortable, the longer you spend somewhere or doing something, particularly with something that's involved in outdoor skill or outdoor learning. So I'm going to come back to some of those, but those are some of the underpinning things we were interested in as part of this project. So first of all, I'd like to comment on thinking about race and access to the waterways. So despite the fact that Leicester is a very diverse city, waterways and the canals and rivers around Leicester, and this is probably true across the UK as well, are really quite white spaces, if you want to put it in those terms. In this picture is one of the volunteers as part of the Canal and Rivers Trust. They're predominantly older white men for various reasons. And a lot of the users of the canal, whether that's canoeists, people who go rowing, even people strolling along the canal, but also particularly canal boat owners and people who use canal boats, it's predominantly very white. And of course, this is one of the reasons that CRT wants to engage a greater diversity of people. what's interesting is that the young people themselves, when we tried to introduce this as a topic to talk about, they rarely mentioned issues around race or diversity directly, but they sometimes talked about it in slightly roundabout ways. So several reflected that they felt like the project could have been more mixed, often referring to the fact that they were a group of Somali young people, all from Somali families, engaged through Socopa. And there was clearly an element of discomfort there around being put together as this kind of single group and introduced into this space where pretty much everyone else was white, including a lot of the project team as well, outside of the community organization. But when we talk to parents on the project, they were really quite conscious of the issue of ethnicity in this environment, and perhaps more broadly in terms of using outdoor spaces in Leicester. This is a quote from one parent. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but they were very conscious of it, of feeling unwelcome, partly because of the way they look, the way they dress. So feeling very self-conscious, going to outdoor spaces, particularly green spaces and including the canal. Many of the parents felt a lot more comfortable sending their children together as part of a Somali community program, that there would be adults from the community there as well, and that their children would be kind of looked after in that way. But it's interesting then that the young people did pick up on this issue around perhaps standing out as a group that had been put together in this way. So I'm not going to talk about this in a lot of detail because I don't have time, but I do think there's an important issue there around the social and cultural context of the way in which the space was used, how that might have caused discomfort for young people, but perhaps made parents more comfortable being in a group identified as from the Somali community. So I want to come on to thinking about what the young people thought of the program. We did a range of activities with them. And I'm not going to talk through this table in detail, but when we looked at what young people prioritized, a lot of them prioritized the personal and social skills as the main outcomes of the program for them, as well as the activity of canoeing. And what was interesting about that is that the issues of the ecology, the wildlife, and the waterway heritage really wasn't such a high priority for them. And although a range of wildlife and heritage activities took place, many found them quite difficult to engage with. They found the waterway environment quite challenging, sometimes dirty and getting wet, and I'll come on to that again later. The age range of 11 to 14 made some activities really quite difficult, activities that were very suitable for 11-year-olds like pond dipping and ecological identification along the canal often didn't suit the older age group, the 14-year-olds. And there was a real mix of skill when it came to the canoeing as well, which made it quite challenging to manage the group. So it was hard to challenge some of the most able and engaged as part of the learning component of the program. So whilst many young people highlighted the skills that they learnt and the teamwork that they engaged with, there was a lot of difficulty in managing the skill progression with canoeing. Most of the young people started in Canadian canoes with 2 or 3 in a canoe. This quickly became quite problematic or difficult because, you know, some excelled, some found it really, really quite difficult. One of the solutions was to put them in these 6-person canoes that you can see on the image here, or images here, which allowed some faster progression, only rowing on one side. But this did really create some tensions with the young people around teamwork. And some of them who had progressed well felt quite held back by this. So there were issues around managing the group outdoors. And so the final thing I want to mention and talk about is this idea of feeling uncomfortable and physical discomfort, as well as perhaps some of the kind of social discomfort of being a sort of single identified ethnic group in the white space of the waterways. So when we asked the young people what the worst things about the project were, they would often comment on the kind of physical elements of being on the waterway. Often getting wet was a problem for many, being splashed. So there was a lot of splashing each other at certain times, falling in, which happened reasonably frequently. But other things like seeing bugs on their body is a quote here, and the stinky changing rooms. So again, the facilities and the whole kind of environment around the canal. But conversely, some of the young people really enjoyed those activities. They liked, you know, the play, splashing and fighting that went on the water. So actually not being allowed to do those things became a problem. Some kind of talked this up a little bit. So one young person said, I was scared. Then I realized I had no reason to be scared because I couldn't canoe properly and I drowned. Now they didn't drown, that probably may have made the news, but they didn't drown, but there was a lot of talk about drowning and sinking, etc. So this perception of waterways as dirty sometimes and as difficult spaces was not always really successfully challenged by the end of the project. Many of the young people still perhaps mentioned these things as being a problem for them, even though they'd spent 12 weeks on the waterway. But also splashing was kind of a playful activity. It was enjoyed by many of the young people. So, in some ways, this disgust and this discomfort had a kind of double register that was in sometimes quite difficult to deal with. And so to some extent, becoming more familiar with the canals almost for some meant learning different reasons to dislike the waterways. And I'm not going to talk through this in detail, but one of the things we looked at as part of the project was how instructors and teachers dealt with this expression of discomfort and disgust. And the main aim of this short film that we've turned into a comic strip was to show how instructors had alternative strategies for dealing with the young people being disgusted. So in this sort of extract, there's a young person that notices a dead rat. This is on a canoe of 6 of them, and they all get very kind of disgusted and excited about this. And it becomes, quite a sort of tense moment. And the youth worker who's pictured in the 4 frames here has a kind of classic tactic, if you like, of sort of acknowledging it, but ignoring it and carrying on rowing, whilst the canoe instructor, as this continues and the young people kind of lose concentration on the canoeing because they're worrying about where this dead rat is floating in the water, he interrupts the activity and asks if someone wanted to eat it, which obviously quite disgusting, but that kind of causes them to be a bit shocked, and he tries to then encourage them to keep canoeing, and that does appear to work. And then someone reassesses whether it's a dead rat or whether it's a carton of yogurt instead. So there was obviously some ambiguity there. And I'm not going to talk about this in a lot of detail, but again, it sort of highlights the way in which the sort of dual nature of being disgusted, being uncomfortable in that kind of environment manifests for the young people. This moment was quite excitable, quite exciting for some of them, but also was kind of disgusting and reinforced that kind of idea that the waterway was this kind of horrible place of dead animals. So I think there's perhaps a lot to be said there about how instructors and teachers kind of monitor and use those moments either to kind of reinforce the issue around disgust or deal with it. So very finally, in the last 30 seconds, I just want to kind of comment on this idea of thinking about how this impacts highly able learners. And again, this project wasn't done with this in mind, but I think there are some interesting things that come out of that. One is the spatial context and the sociocultural context of learning skills in outdoor spaces and how they might be perceived by young people and by parents as racialized spaces, perhaps white spaces, and how that's dealt with by the team around them. I think the interesting thing that came out of this, perhaps not a huge surprise, but the value of the social skills and the team working for young people, perhaps over some of the learning outcomes around ecology and heritage learning might be relevant. And also the issues around dealing with a mixed ability in quite a physical environment and handling a group in that kind of space. But also thinking about challenging discomfort. Some of what we might regard as perhaps more able learners as part of our group who were perhaps more able canoers, they often wanted to get on with activities, but also enjoyed the moments of play and sometimes disgust. And how, again, you deal with that challenge, I think is interesting. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you all for listening. And I guess I'm handing back to Margaret to hand us on to who's next.
Yeah, Tom, that was great. We've been tweeting there, and I just loved the idea of the worst thing was the stinky changing rooms. I'm going to hand over now to Rhea. Tom and Rhea have worked together on different projects, and Rhea works now here in the University of Glasgow. So Rhea, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi. Yes, it's a very small world, very weirdly, with Cardiff and Glasgow connections. So I'm Rhea Dunkley, and I'm a lecturer in geography, environment and sustainability now in the School of Education. And I teach in the field of primary education, but most of my research is about eco-pedagogy. So the kind of notion of teaching people with the aim of thinking about tackling environmental crisis. And I just wanted to spend a moment saying kind of why that's an important thing to do. I think that kind of research is important, and to think about these issues across the life course is really important, because we're living at a time of great change. And so we need to think about what social science can contribute to that, and what education can contribute to that. Because as the latest report from the International Panel from Climate Change has shown, we are facing rapid and unprecedented changes in our climate. So there's a lot of urgency. And so for me, what I'm doing is a lot of it's framed in that context now. So it's about, I guess, doing things that aren't just about technological fixes or nature-based solutions even, but thinking about what education can contribute. And I'm sure that may be a concern that highly able learners probably share in terms of some of the calls that are coming from youth groups, like Fridays for the Future at the moment. So thinking about that in terms of citizen science then, and this idea of Spotterbee that I'm going to be talking about, is the project was created in 2016 very much with those kinds of issues in mind. So the ideas of connecting people to the natural world, of getting a sort of awareness of what goes on in a city for other species other than ourselves, and how we need to relate to that in a greater sense to actually create change. I wanted to spend a quick minute just talking about what citizen science is, because it's not a term that everyone knows, as I recently discovered at a science festival. So environmental citizen science, as a kind of branch of the overall topic, is a practice of what's called open science that's involved in getting everybody who's interested in the collection of scientific data. And it's valuable in and of itself because of its capacity to enhance that connection to your wider environment. But that connection to the wider environment is also thought now to be beneficial in terms of mental health and well-being benefits for individuals who make those connections. And of course, there's the much wider impact that you might have on planetary health through collecting this kind of data. So citizen science is an activity that enhances ecological awareness for young people, and that's underexplored in academic literature currently. So most of the papers that are written are sort of a generalist nature rather than in an education context. Citizen science has also been really spurred on by the digital revolution, as it's called, in the sort of 1980s and onwards, to mean that those citizen science actually happened since the 1800s with kind of bird count surveys and things. Because of the internet, it can be carried out at scale and scope never imagined by scientists in terms of what you're able to collect. And they're really growing in popularity, particularly during lockdown. We saw a huge uptake in Spotterbee, and other citizen science projects reported similar benefits because of the burgeoning awareness of local ecologies and the spaces around us, because people were out walking more and kind of observing their environments a little bit more too. To think about that then in the sense of what that means for childhood, for children. So in the 21st century, Margaret's already said that we're confronting massive issues, and for young people that can present particular complex problems for thinking about how they relate to these big challenges of environmental and social crisis, and feelings of empathy that can be created but perhaps not easily dealt with. And what it means for young people is that citizen science offers a way of engaging through a range of different kinds of topics like bee, butterfly monitoring, water monitoring, tree monitoring, to think about these issues like climate change and ecological emergency in the sense that you're actually doing something, that you're contributing to wider scientific research, that you may be generating data that can be used for lobbying purposes to, say, local governments to change actual situations. So there's a sense of empowerment in a time of emergency that can go with a citizen science methodology. And so it can be a way of kind of living on or living through really uncertain times for young people. And so when you think about all of that in terms of what citizen science does, and when I think about what Margaret was saying about the high ability learners, intense concentration, ability to hold keen interests, need to learn more, and having a propensity to want to know more and do more about key issues, it would seem that citizen science is a really kind of powerful approach for engaging those learners. So I just want to say something quickly now about Spot Bee and what it is. So it's freely available. You download it from the App Store and Google Play. And it was established in 2016 by myself and a colleague in the School of Pharmacy in Cardiff University when I was working down there. And we came up with this idea together just from going to a bug life workshop, where we just thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do something that kind of allows us to understand the kinds of plants that bees are interested in cities and that are most helpful for bees, but that also connects people in urban environments, because we know that there are less opportunities to connect. And so we really sort of thought we could use the bee to guide people's eyes towards the natural surroundings of their city. So the app collects photographs. So as you can see, there's a little picture of a phone on the screen there, and it collects images, but it asks people to upload an image, and then it geographically references those images, and you write just a little description of what you're observing. You try and identify what the plant is, try and identify what the bee is, and say something about the kind of conditions that you're observing within. Since its launch of the app in particular, which we got funding for last year, it's now had 11,500 photos submitted to it. And we've been through a process of trying to verify those images. But what's really wonderful about it is that a real community of bee spotters has emerged within it. And you'll find, I'm sure it must be highly able learning groups within it who have just become prolific bee spotters, and so have like over 1,000 records for just one individual in a place. So it can be something, citizen science can be something that small groups of people or even an individual becomes quite fanatical about, which can be a really beneficial thing both for the science and for the individual in terms of providing an outlet. So most of this kind of human nature connection is what interests me as a social scientist, but the data is also, we're hoping, going to be useful to other organisations, to actually charitable organisations, to make the case for the increasing bee-friendly habitats in cities too over time. So just to look briefly at the pedagogy then of what's going on in citizen science that makes me think that this is a valuable thing, and what's going on in Spotted Bee in particular. And I've sort of boiled this down that there are 4 stages, I think, to the process that are beneficial in terms of learning. So the first step is the observation itself. So downloading the Spotted Bee app, and then that's an invitation to follow the bees to identify plants that they're reliant upon in urban environments. And there are benefits in that process itself. For example, it's been argued that in Western society we don't pay enough attention to plants, and that's resulted in what's known as plant blindness. So if you think about, like, our teddy bears tend to be all of bears and other kind of creatures, but we don't have many cactuses, teddy bears when we're children. So there are all these sort of things to point to the fact that we ignore the sort of landscapes upon which life is enacted. So it could be a way of tackling that. There's also the issue of the mental health benefits. So there've been writing that have shown that just looking at flowers actually has a really positive emotional impact and mental health benefit. So that's really, I guess, one benefit of it, in terms of that actual just process of observation of the plantscapes that are around young people on school buildings and hidden in railway sidings, and even on wastelands in places you wouldn't expect to find plants. Then there's the capturing stage, so actually taking the photographs and increasing your digital literacy in terms of engaging, using a camera, learning how to frame, all of those kinds of things. There's a skill-based element to the practice that can be beneficial too. The third stage, I would say, is to do with the recording process. So in terms of pedagogic attainment, the spotting activity gives people the chance to pay attention to plants in a really kind of in-depth way. So it's actually a way of gaining what might be called plant literacy. So learning how to identify what species you're looking at. And the same with bees, you're actually learning something about what different kinds of bees look like. And then the final stage, and perhaps this is the most impactful in terms of highly able learners, and what I was thinking when Margaret was talking too, is that reflection. So being able to place what you're learning within that wider context of sort of why are certain areas planted up with beautiful flowers whilst other areas are not so, thinking about urban ecology might be something that could be particularly beneficial for young people. And in that reflection stage as well, there's that opportunity to interact through comments on Spotted Bee, but also to look at the maps and see what your place looks like in relation to other places too. So I realise I don't have a great deal of time left here, so I just want to kind of leave you with saying that what Spotted Bee is all about is just to get people to look closely, to observe, to become part of the community, and it's a practice that can be enhanced through adding additional resources. So we created Spotted Bee, but we've also created learning resources that go with the project and around the project, and that's something that could be looked at in the context of highly able learners specifically. So if you did want to learn more about the project, we have a website, spotterbee.buzz, and we have social media, iSpotterbee, and of course you could download the app and have a play around with it. And I'd be more than happy to speak to anyone as well who's interested in kind of working with school groups on this, or individuals as well. So thanks very much for your time, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rhea, and Carolina has put in the link to iSpotterbee there in the chat. If you're interested in that, again, another project with wonderful opportunities for everybody, and then just that little bit of thought about how do we tweak it to really do something for those highly able learners. And I'd love to know more about those young people posting 1,000 posts, Rhea. We must chat. I'd like to hand over now to, let me just check, yes, to Catherine. Catherine is also here at Glasgow, and Catherine's project has come out of her work with our undergraduate students here in the School of Education, thinking around issues of initial teacher education. So Catherine, can I hand over to you?
Hi, let me just share my screen with you, which I think I'll need permission to do, as I seem to have lost my host privileges.
Oh, you've been misbehaving again, Catherine.
And have to keep your eye on me, I quite understand. I've popped my email address and my Twitter handle in the chat there, just because I'm hoping that some of you might be in touch after I've had a chance to talk to you about this project. I'm still not having any luck sharing my screen.
I think I have your presentation here. If we're stuck, I can show it.
Yep, I think we may be stuck.
Okay, we'll start talking till I find your presentation, and then we'll, as soon as I find it, I'll share it.
So the project I'm wanting to talk to you about is a project called the Wee Beasties project. And what we're aiming to do with this project is we're aiming to look at using creativity, using young people's joy in fantasy and in making things up, to at once highlight issues to do with climate change in their own communities, and also to start getting them thinking in creative ways about higher education and how higher education could be meaningful for their own lives. So here we have a sample of a wee beastie in its natural habitat, which is my mint plant. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk to you a wee bit about how we're hoping this project is going to happen. Could I have the next slide? So we're aiming this at primary 4 to primary 7 pupils studying in Scottish primary schools. We're hoping that young people will invent their own wee beastie and think about where it might live, where it might fit into their own environment. Then we're hoping to give them an opportunity to do some research on what kinds of climate issues might affect their wee beastie. Is their wee beastie an aquatic wee beastie that lives in the sea and is going to be bothered by plastic? Is their wee beastie a beastie who is having terrible difficulties because it keeps getting its head stuck in rubbish? What issues of climate change, what issues of pollution are going to affect their little creature? Then, having thought about that, having an opportunity to think and research about that, they're then going to come to University of Glasgow on a mission to discover how studying at university, how research can help them, their wee beastie, deal with climate change. And so the reason why we're doing it this way is to engage their creativity, to give them an opportunity to think about what kinds of things go on at universities that might be relevant for this very serious issue, and then what might that have to do with me? And can I have the next slide? So if you were a young person taking part in our project, here's the first thing that would happen for you. You'd make up your beastie. So you would have some help to do that. We're certainly not going to throw somebody to the wolves and say, right, invent a fancy creature right now, thank you. So there would be help about, well, do you want to start with a creature that really exists? And then tweak it slightly? Do you want to think about how a fantasy creature that you love might survive in suburbia? Do you want to think about putting two creatures together and thinking about what that might be like, where it might live, and what it might do? You're going to draw it, you're going to cut it out, you're going to take it to a place in your local area where you think it would live and take a photograph. That's then going to give you an opportunity to come back with your photograph and do a little bit of writing about your beastie, how it lives, what it does, what its life is like. That's meant to give it a kind of solidity. It's got a place, it's got to live, and there are going to be issues that affect it. Could I have the next slide? So you're going to be thinking up a creature. You're going to, I hope, have some emotional engagement with your creature because it's yours, you invented it. And you're going to have a little bit of confidence, because one of the things you're going to do with your beastie once it's got a home, once it's got a story, is you're going to send it into a website where it's going to be displayed, and you're going to see your work online. Could I have the next slide? Once your creature has an environment, you are going to get the opportunity to think about how is that environment changing? What does that have to do with climate change for your beastie? What problems might your beastie face that are to do with global warming, that are to do with pollution, that are to do with rubbish, that are to do with humans being in places that didn't used to be humans? This is the section that may be particularly exciting for highly able pupils because it's completely open-ended. You could approach this from my beastie gets its head stuck in a box and therefore it's unhappy. You could approach this from, well, I really want to talk to you about microplastics in the ocean, and how you engage with that is going to depend very much on your own interests and passions as a learner. Thank you. If I could have the next slide. This is going to give your teacher opportunities to teach research skills, which are important for everybody, but I would argue particularly important for highly able young people, as finding out how to know more can be one of the best and most effective ways to combat boredom. And for teachers, we're hoping that we're going to be able to support that by providing some access to good quality web resources. So for example, if you had a young person who was very worried about parasites, the link on that slide is a link to the very best animation I have ever seen about sheep parasites, which is not something that you're going to know necessarily as a primary teacher, but having access to resources, having places to start looking can then start open doors for, okay, well, I'm interested in parasites in that context. What else could I find out about this? What else could I find out about the chemicals that are used to treat them? What else could I find out about how those become ineffective? And a whole world opens out just from that one useful little seed. Thank you. Could I have the next slide? So you have a beastie. Your beastie has a problem. What are they going to do about it? Well, they're going to come to university. And your beastie is going to have the opportunity, either virtually or hopefully in person, to see around the University of Glasgow, to visit the different colleges and the different schools, and to think about what could their beastie do to help them deal with climate change. And one really important hope that we have for this phase of the project is to open up ideas a little bit about what can people actually do. Yes, your beastie might be an engineer who builds a machine to fish plastic out of the oceans, but your beastie might also be a lawyer who takes companies to court for misbehaving themselves, or a journalist who lets people know that there's a very big problem here that we need to know about. So the idea of moving climate change from something, oh, this is really only for people who are passionate about STEM, to this is something that we can all have a voice and we can all act in, is something that we're hoping will really, really benefit young people. We're also, of course, hoping that for those young people who are maybe not 100% confident about whether university is something that people like them actually do, then a little bit of distance, sending your beastie rather than yourself, may give them an opportunity to think about it in a slightly more fun, slightly more engaging kind of way. Having been to visit a university, you're then going to do a little bit of writing, which again can vary from a sentence for those who are at that stage through to 1,000 words from someone who's really got the bit between their teeth and really wants to tell you in detail about their plans. And that again will be added to our website. So we're hoping to end up with a map of wee beasties across Scotland. Could I have the next slide? This is particularly important from the point of view of the research that some of the research that I'm engaged in at the moment. We know that many Scottish young people from areas of high deprivation don't consider going to university, no matter how able they are, no matter what their potential might be. They think of it as something that's not for the likes of me. Many young people are unclear about what actually goes on at universities or how they might be involved in that. For a lot of the young people I used to work with when I was a teacher, what happened at universities was the Big Bang Theory, and that was that. So helping young people to imagine their beasties and themselves at university, we hope could support them in considering university for themselves in the future. Even better if that then links back into climate change and what can be done about climate change. Could I have the next slide? So what's this got to do with what's going on in primary schools? We're hoping that Wee Beasties, as well as being a useful thing in itself, will also fit in with some key E's and O's. And one of the things that I'd be keen to do if you think that your class or your child might be interested in is get in touch with you and let you have some information on which experiences and outcomes from the curriculum this will cover. We are hoping that this will be a project that's very flexible, so young people who need a higher level of challenge can be quite straightforwardly supported in accessing it at that level, but that it can also include those for whom maybe writing a sentence or drawing a picture is a really impressive day's work. And we're hoping that people will be able to share, to see other people's wee beasties, to get excited about what other people are doing, and to be able to think creatively about, okay, this is a serious problem. How are we going to solve it? Could I have the next slide? I would be ecstatic if you were to get in touch with me. And we'd love to hear from schools that think they might be involved, from parents or young people who think they might be involved. Because we're really, really hoping to get somewhere with our wee beasties in the very near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Great to hear more about wee beasties and all, again, the potential links to curriculum, raising aspirations and so on too, and some good tips for some resources there. And our final speakers, before we come on to all of you with your questions, I'm absolutely delighted, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Cheryl, who is here in Glasgow, and Ian, who is in Leeds. And they're going to share a little bit about their project that they've been doing through the International Green Academy. So over to you two.
Thanks very much, Margaret. So hello, everyone. My name is Cheryl McGeechan, and I'm a human geographer working at the University of Glasgow. And this is my colleague, Ian Shaw, who is a associate professor of global and security challenges at the University of Leeds. And we're really delighted to be here today to share with you some insights from our collaboration called the International Green Academy. And if you could press the next slide, Ian, that'd be great. So the International Green Academy was founded over 2 years ago by Ian and myself with the mission to research how universities, schools and communities can work together to build gardens that empower young people to become confident ecological stewards. And we believe that this is a task more increasingly urgent than ever in the age of the climate crisis. Inspired by the very successful University of Arizona Community and School Garden Programme in Tucson, we've sought to work in partnership with schools and communities to consider how gardens can provide innovative educational spaces for growing new socially just worlds. If we can have the next slide, please, Ian.
Cheryl, just to double check, what are you seeing on the screen share?
We're not seeing the full slide.
Okay, let me just
Okay.
try. Is that better?
No.
Is that better?
No. I think it's the same problem we had before with the different screens.
Yeah. Is that any better?
So what I would do is if you start your presentation, yeah.
That's better.
Yeah. All right.
We're there now. So if you can go to slide 3, that would be great. So our mission is guided by aspects of empower, connect, deliver, produce, and create.
Is it sorry, Cheryl, what slide?
We're just on this first slide, so if you can move to the third one, that would be great.
Oh, God, it's not working. Hang on. I'm just going to stop the screen share altogether and then restart. Is that okay?
Yes. Yep.
Screen sharing for highly able learners.
So if you start your presentation first and then you share the screen where your presentation is.
Do you want me to share it, Ian?
I think that just might be the easiest thing, Cheryl. Yeah.
We say this, it might not be. Okay, let's have a look. Can folks see anything? I think we're just, there we go. Okay, so our mission is guided by aspects of empower, connect, deliver, produce, and create. And we want to empower an international team of researchers and school teachers are really important to our mission, to develop innovative school and community garden partnerships that bridge urban biomes. We wish to connect students to their local environment and encourage an awareness of urban environmental justice, sustainability, and food autonomy. We want to deliver students with the resources to improve their gardening skills, scientific knowledge, collaborative capacities, and ecological citizenship, all with the aim of producing innovative curricula and policy that can be shared between schools and communities and create world-class scholarship to guide future school and community garden developments. To date, we've partnered with 6 high schools, 1 primary school, and 1 community organisation to develop and build new garden spaces and to deliver a range of outdoor and indoor, depending on the weather, educational classes. And we would like to share with you just a quick extract of our teaching to give you a flavour of what we do and how we do it.
So we thought it might be an interesting sort of experiment to share with you an example of one of the electives that we run. And in doing so, what we really want to kind of highlight is just how scalable this is, especially for highly able learners. We think that so much of soil ecology, for example, the detail and the concepts that you go into are really scalable. So we just wanted to give you a sample of a kind of PowerPoint that we've done with undergraduates all the way down to S3 students. So if we go to the next slide, Cheryl, you'll see that we kind of usually start by trying to signal just how important and why soil is so important, because a lot of the students that we talk to just see soil as dead, as inert, as just kind of, yeah, something that you walk on but never really think about. So what we're always trying to do in our lessons, whether they're indoor or outdoor, is in some way try and bring soil to life. And we do that by sort of highlighting that it's actually an ecosystem. And it's absolutely teeming with life. And as we say here, it actually hosts a quarter of the world's biodiversity. So we usually go in there and actually just try and counter some of their expectations about, you know, what soil is, and trying to get them to think about soil differently. So to do that, we've done lots of activities with them. I think one of the ones that's most sort of successful is just to get students to go dig up and find their own soil samples. And that can be from around a school or even in the same small area. The type of soil varies quite rapidly, and you can just look at it there or then, or another activity is to put it into kind of a glass jar, add water, shake it up, and then examine it sort of the next day. And so this sort of segues into thinking about, well, what exactly is living in soil? And I think soil's a really good thing for highly able students to think about because of its interconnection with all life on Earth. So right up to sort of the human food chain and some of the global challenges that we face, we need to think seriously about soil, about protecting soil, about understanding soil. So, you know, like I said at the beginning, I think learning about soil as an ecosystem is really important, and so much of that life is invisible. So what we then try and do, if you look at the next slide, is we try and give an example of, even in just like a handful of soil, it's absolutely just overrun and teeming with life, right from, you know, earthworms, which is, I guess, one of the most obvious ones, through to tiny fungal networks, to nematodes. All of these things are in just one handful of soil. So then what we do is we, typically usually start with the things that are most obvious to see, and that's earthworms. We talk about their function, which is primarily acting as these little recycling machines of chewing up big pieces of compost and making them smaller, and in doing so, increasing the aeration and the structure of the soil. Cheryl and I have had lots of great sort of examples of students absolutely screaming when they find worms. But it's all about making, I think, friends with worms, given their importance. So I think so much of what Cheryl and I have done is to see these creepy crawlies or these wee beasties as friends and as allies on the planet. So we start with worms, then we move on to looking at, I guess, we often describe them as smaller worms, which is nematodes, which can be more sort of microscopic. Essentially, they have a very, very similar function as worms in that they are acting like little recycling machines, and also helping to spread organic matter around the soil. One of the things that we find most important with learners of all kind of abilities is to connect these small details about life on Earth to the sort of the bigger questions, and reviewing whether or not their perception of the soil has changed at all. So we'll constantly kind of interrupt and provoke them of, well, what have we just said, and why do you think it's important to learn about the soil as living? So after we've introduced them to the first two beasties, we then move on to looking at fungi and fungal networks, which has honestly been sort of the most eye-opening thing for me, given that a lot of what we know about sort of fungi and the scope of fungal networks is really interesting and new science. And this is a really important thing to reflect on with highly able learners, precisely because it breaks down this idea that a plant or a tree is kind of an independent organism. And actually what sort of fungi do in the soil is that they connect the tree to the soil, but also in really cool ways, connect trees to other trees, connect plants to other plants, forming these kinds of symbiotic fungal relationships. So again, if you move on to the next sort of slide, Cheryl, you'll see that these mycorrhizal networks that are absolutely incredible. And coming into this project with Cheryl, looking at school and community gardens, I just didn't really understand how complex and how interdependent plants were in the soil. So, getting students to think through, again, the relationships, and I think this is a key thing when we're talking about ecology, it's relationships, not just between a soil and a plant, but how plants rely on a range of intermediaries, such as bugs, such as fungal networks, to talk to each other and to survive. And then finally, I'm not going to kind of dwell on the next thing, which is looking at bacteria. But again, we talk about what bacteria do, and an example of that on the next slide is looking at a very specific bacteria, which is the kind of nitrogen fixing bacteria that we find making relationships with beans of all different kinds. And again, it's quite an amazing thing to think about bacteria not as enemies, but as friends, in the same way that we're trying to make friendships with worms and all these other different kinds of species that you wouldn't necessarily expect students and expect young people to think about as utterly important to human life as we know it. I think that might be my final slide, and it's a question that is really, really philosophical. And I love asking young people this or adults this, and it's a question of, well, is there even such a thing as a single plant? If you were to look at a plant and you were to ask, well, where does it start and where does it finish? If you were to say, well, it finishes its roots, you would miss out all the kind of fungal networks that tap in and connect the roots to the soil. You would miss out all the bacterial machinery that surrounds a plant as well. So this is a really great concept, a really great question for highly able learners to really probe their sort of ecological mindsets. Thanks.
So at the very heart of all of our teaching, and we didn't really talk about us actually going into the garden, but we do that as well. So at the heart of all of our teaching philosophies lies the notion of world building, a sense of collaborative doings or doings in common. And we see the garden as an important space where working for and with the world becomes possible, a space where new skills are learned and shared across all participants, and as a place where new relationships with the earth and with one another are formed and challenged, especially, as Ian said, when you bring worms into the mix. An important aspect of our practice, as highlighted in our School Garden Manifesto and through Ian's example, is the notion that learning beyond classroom walls is transformative. By activating our senses, thinking creatively and working outdoors, we can develop new ecological skills that are crucial for generating more hopeful futures. Across our teaching and garden work, we are becoming increasingly aware of the impact of the climate crisis on the young people we are encountering. We see gardens and growing as ways of offering important challenges to ecological and climate anxiety. Eco-anxiety can be described as a sense of fear, hopelessness and despair at an earth on fire. And recent studies have shown that over 60% of young people across the globe are very or extremely worried about climate change. We believe that gardens as educational spaces for all can be places of empowerment for young people that are crucially needed for tackling the global climate challenges we face requires learning a range of practical and philosophical skills for ecological and social justice. And we hope we've begun to highlight some of the ways in which we are trying to do this through the International Green Academy in this presentation today. So thank you everyone so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about what we do at the International Green Academy, you can have a look at our website. So thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Can you just very quickly say which schools you've been in Glasgow? Because I know you have been in schools.
Yeah, so we've been in Drumchapel, St Mungo's, Beauclair, Govan, St Thomas's, so a range of different Glasgow high schools that we've worked in.
Great, thank you very much, and great links again. I think you can see kind of common threads there going through those 4 presentations, particularly in relation to things like open-ended questions, big philosophical questions, and just the great opportunity that the great outdoors offers us all. Now, you've heard a lot of talking from us. There's been comments in the chat. Anybody get any questions, or have we talked you into submission? If you've got any questions, please let us know. Anything we can help you with, direct you with, you want to know any more about. Anybody doing anything in their schools they'd like to share about? Oh, there's a new message here. Is there a website for the wee beasties, Catherine?
There will be very soon. We're in the process of working out how we can make a map of Scotland, so you can click on a map of Scotland and see which beasties are in which areas. However, that's proving to be a slight technical challenge. So once we've conquered that, then yes, there will be a website, and that will be advertised once it's up and running.
So just keep watching this space, Robert, I think is the answer there. I noticed a few people talking about the wee beasties and about that kind of link into between primary and secondary, that whole, and further on to that widening participation link that Catherine spoke about being so important. Somebody in the Isle of Arran, Victoria, and just starting a project in biodiversity and interdependency. Loads of ideas to extend this, love it, great. And I'll tell you something, we would love to hear about your project, Victoria. So please keep in touch with us. We'd love to hear about that. Is that in secondary school, Victoria, or primary schools, or both perhaps? Primary, great. Certainly lots of opportunity in rural areas, but I think one of the things that struck me as well about Tom's presentation is that idea of looking at where you are, finding out where you are in the world and where you are in your city even, and the I Spot a Bees project too, obviously being in a starting off in a more urban kind of area too. Somebody else looking for some information about wee beasties?
If you can send me an email, I've got a little pack that I can send out to you that's got just a little bit more information, and it all broken down with the E's and O's. Again, it's not quite online yet, but very soon, we hope.
At least you know that once it is, there's people wanting to find out about it, Catherine. Anybody else got anything? I think I was struck too by the I Spot a Bee presentation as well, and the idea of ecology running through, I think, to all the presentations, and just the opportunities that it offers for kind of everybody. Not a question, that's okay, John. PGDA, we've recently been learning about mastery orientated learning. This projects and topics certainly go a long way in encouraging learning for the content, not the test. Yeah, the only thing I would just, a word of caution from me about mastery. We do a lot of overlearning for young people, and many young people need that overlearning. When we're thinking about high label, just take care. Sometimes they can get it with 3 examples, they've got it, they frankly need no more. So just think about overlearning and stuff, and that whole mastery concept. We'd love to compare soil samples here and there, but I think that might be one for Cheryl, is it? Cheryl and Ian?
Ian's the soil guy, but I think one of the fun things we find is you know, just actually getting young people to go outside and just to dig up a bit of soil for themselves, so just so that they can get a sense of what is actually underneath their feet is a really cool idea, and laying it all out side by side in different areas is also cool too. So yeah.
I wanted to watch out for high label pupils, and it came up in Tom's presentation, was the getting dirty in things. Some young people love that. Sometimes some high label pupils actually don't want to get kind of down and dirty with their fingers and hands, and it can cause quite a lot of anxiety. So just watch out for those things where they maybe have the curiosity, the capacity, the interest, the knowledge, all sorts of things, but just don't want to physically do it. So just take care for those kind of things when you're working with young people. I was struck by Ian saying you think soil's just kind of dead and kind of there, but it's so not. Again, it's capturing that kind of enthusiasm and imagination, I guess, for them. Nearly at the end of our time, and I don't want to drag this out any longer if we've kind of run out of questions. Can we remind you that I think, Carolina, there's a little questionnaire. This is part of the Explorathon sessions that are running. There's some amazing opportunities for you to engage in all kinds of things. And I think that idea of citizen science as well that Rhea spoke about, there's so many opportunities for you as well as for your young people around just now. So I would encourage you to go and look at all the Explorathon events that are on just now. And there is a little survey there. Carolina's just put it into the chat. we'd be really grateful if you would complete that. And if you take up any of the ideas from any of the 4 presentations, and if you're doing anything particularly in relation to high label, we'd love to hear about anything that you might pick up on, because the purpose of this was that it wasn't just about high label. It was about look at these fantastic projects, think how you can make them work for you, but obviously tonight with a slight focus on the high label. But any of these projects, anything you do, we'd love to hear from you. Each of the presenters involved would love to hear from you. If you are doing something around high label, then myself at the Scottish Network for Able Pupils would love to know more about what you're doing. And if there are no more questions, can I thank our presenters for this evening? And remember, Tom had to leave to do the nursery pickup, but he's more than happy to have anybody contacting them individually. And can I say a huge thank you to the Tile Network. SNAP and the Tile Network have collaborated now in quite a few events, and it's just wonderful to work with Carolina. So Carolina, thank you for all your work. And it just remains for me to say good night and thank you to everybody for coming, and have a great time out there with bugs, bees, plants and the great outdoors. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you very much.